I trusted him with everything. My money, my business, even my family. Then I found out he'd been stealing from me the whole time. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was realizing how long he'd been planning it, and how many people he'd told about it before I ever knew. If you're new here, hit subscribe before this gets worse, because what happened next is the kind of thing that makes you question everyone around you. 3 years ago, I hired Marcus Webb to run operations for my real estate company. He came recommended by someone I'd known for 20 years, which should have been enough. But I did my own checks anyway. Clean background, solid experience, exactly what the company needed at that stage. He was sharp in meetings, detail-oriented, the kind of person you immediately trust with responsibility. Within the first year, I was handing him access to everything: client accounts, vendor relationships, the main operating budget, keys to every property we managed. That was the thing about Marcus. He didn't ask for authority. You wanted to give it to him because he made it easy. He handled problems before they became problems. He called clients the way I would have called them. He understood what the business needed without me having to spell it out every single time. My wife said within 6 months that she'd never seen me more relaxed about work. She meant it as a compliment. Looking back, it was probably a warning I didn't know how to recognize. The real estate market shifted in the winter of that year. Nothing catastrophic, just the natural kind of cooling that happens in the business cycle. A project we'd been developing stalled during the permitting phase. A commercial property we'd leased took longer to fill than we'd projected. Nothing unusual, nothing that derailed the company. But it was enough that the margins got tighter. Cash flow became something we had to think about month to month, instead of the kind of thing that just happened naturally. That's when I should have been paying closer attention. That's when I should have questioned the reports Marcus started bringing me. Instead, I was busy. I was managing 3 property acquisitions and dealing with family issues that had nothing to do with the business. I was exactly the kind of person who doesn't read every line of every report, just the summaries, just the bottom numbers. Marcus started talking about moving certain accounts. He explained it in terms that made perfect sense: optimization, tax efficiency, better positioning for the upcoming quarter. He had a consulting firm he wanted to route some vendor payments through. They could provide better service delivery, he said, and the costs would actually be lower once the service model was restructured. He had contracts drawn up. Everything looked official. Everything looked planned. I signed them without reading them carefully because Marcus had never given me a reason not to trust him, and because I was tired, and because the margins were tight, and anything that might improve them seemed worth considering. That went on for 8 months. 8 months of vendor payments being moved through a consulting entity that Marcus controlled. 8 months of me signing off on financial documents that showed steady operations while underneath it all, something else was happening entirely. The moment I found out should have come from me doing my job properly. Instead, it came by accident. My accountant called me on a Tuesday morning to ask why I'd approved a payment to an account in Mexico. Not the consulting firm, a different account, a different country, a payment for services that didn't match anything in our records. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. I didn't call Marcus immediately. I called my attorney instead. I told her what I'd noticed, what I'd approved, what suddenly didn't make sense. She said she'd look into the accounts quietly before I said anything. She called me back 3 days later with information I wasn't prepared to hear. The consulting firm didn't exist. Or rather, it existed on paper, but there were no employees, no operations, no actual service delivery. It was just a vehicle. The payments being routed through it were being pulled from there into a series of accounts that Marcus had opened using a false business identification. Some of the money had gone to the Mexico account. Some had been used to purchase equipment in his name. Some had simply disappeared into transfers that didn't have a clear endpoint. The total was $340,000, not enough to sink the company, enough to hurt, enough to be deliberate. My accountant wanted to call the police immediately. My attorney wanted to wait until she'd documented everything. I wanted to have a conversation with Marcus that made sense of how a person I'd trusted this completely could do something like this. What I did instead was sit in my office with the door closed and think about how long this had actually been going on, because the planning alone would have taken months. The account setup, the documentation, the way it was all structured to look legitimate, that didn't happen because Marcus decided on a whim to take advantage of me. That happened because he'd thought about it, because he'd decided I was worth stealing from before he ever asked me to sign the first document. I called him into my office on a Friday afternoon. I told him I needed to talk about some accounting questions that had come up. I asked him directly whether he'd set up any accounts or consulting arrangements beyond what appeared in the official records. He didn't hesitate. He said no. He looked me in the eye and told me there was nothing in our financial structure that he hadn't discussed with me fully. I showed him the documentation my accountant had compiled. I watched his face go through the particular sequence of emotions that happens when a person realizes they've been caught and there's no way to talk their way out of it. He changed his approach immediately. He told me that the money was meant to be temporary, that he'd been planning to move it all back into the company accounts before the annual audit. He said he'd had personal financial problems that spiraled beyond his control, and the money was supposed to be a short-term solution. He said he regretted it. He said he understood it was wrong. He said all the things that people say when they're caught and they're hoping contrition might buy forgiveness. What I understood in listening to him was that none of it was true. Not the regret, not the explanation, maybe not even the personal problems. What was true was that he'd stolen from me because he thought he could, because he'd watched me trust him and decided that trust could be exploited, because he'd built a structure designed to hide what he was doing, and he'd built it carefully enough that it might have worked if a random accountant didn't call me about an odd payment. The legal process that followed was the kind of thing that takes over your life in ways you don't anticipate. There were meetings with attorneys. There was documentation to compile and hand over to investigators. There was the strange experience of sitting through a deposition where Marcus's lawyer tried to create doubt about whether I actually knew the full scope of my own company's finances. That was the angle they tried to work, that I'd been negligent, that I'd given this person authority without oversight, that in some way my lack of attention had created the opportunity he'd exploited. What they never argued was that he hadn't stolen the money. The evidence was too clear for that. The accounts existed. The payments existed. The false business registration existed. All of it was there in the records. So instead they tried to blame me for not paying closer attention. They tried to make it seem like I'd been irresponsible with my own company. And what struck me during that process was how much easier it would have been if I could actually blame myself. If I could have said I should have been monitoring everything more carefully, then at least I could have learned something from it. I could have moved forward believing that if I just did things differently, paid attention differently, trusted differently, then nothing like this would ever happen again. But that wasn't the actual lesson. The actual lesson was harder because it had nothing to do with my performance and everything to do with who Marcus had chosen to be. He could have asked me for a loan if he was in financial trouble. We'd known each other for years. I'd given him access to the company because I believed in him. Any number of approaches would have been different from what he actually did. But he chose to steal. He chose to lie about it. He chose to build an entire structure designed to hide it. Those were choices, not accidents. Those were the product of deciding that he could put his needs ahead of my trust without consequence. The company survived it, but barely. The $340,000 had to be reabsorbed. Some clients left because the disruption to operations during the investigation affected their services. I had to restructure the entire accounting department because I couldn't trust the systems Marcus had been managing. I brought in new people with fresh perspective, but for months afterward, I was looking at every financial report like it might be hiding something else. Marcus went to trial. His attorney made all the standard arguments. He claimed financial desperation. He claimed he'd planned to return the money. He claimed I'd been a bad employer in ways that had pressured him into this situation. None of it worked. The evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of fraud and embezzlement. He served 2 years before he was released. That should have been the end of it. What I didn't anticipate was that during those 2 years, while he was in prison, Marcus had been talking. He'd been telling other inmates about the company. He'd been describing the details of what he'd done. He'd been turning the story of stealing from me into something like a masterclass in how to exploit someone's trust. When he got out, one of the people he'd been talking to decided they wanted to try the same thing with another business. That person got caught relatively quickly. But before they got caught, they'd told someone else. And somewhere in that chain, the story had become something mythologized. Marcus had become the guy who figured out how to disappear money from a company without getting caught immediately. That was false. He got caught because I had a good accountant who asked the right questions. But the narrative had taken on a life of its own anyway. I heard about it through a business associate who'd been approached by someone looking for advice on how to structure fraudulent accounts. The person doing the asking had mentioned that they'd been inspired by a real case, a guy named Marcus Webb, who'd supposedly stolen hundreds of thousands before anyone noticed. My associate knew I worked in real estate. She connected the dots. She told me this conversation had happened at a networking event, in a room full of other business owners, most of whom had no idea that the story being discussed was about my company. That was the part that got to me more than the actual theft. It wasn't just that someone had stolen from me. It was that he'd turned the theft into a kind of story he could tell, a narrative that made him sound clever instead of what he actually was. It was that he'd spent 2 years in prison, basically recruiting people to commit similar crimes. It was that my failure to pay close attention had somehow become an instruction manual that was being passed around business circles. I changed how I approached management after that. I brought in auditors quarterly instead of annually. I required secondary approval for any payment over $10,000. I restructured how access was distributed so that no single person had complete control over financial systems. I did all the things that should have been in place already, but somehow never seemed necessary when business was moving smoothly and you had someone you trusted completely. What I didn't do was stop trusting people. That's what everyone expects. That a betrayal like this would make you paranoid, cynical, unwilling to delegate anything. Maybe for some people it works that way. For me, it didn't. I still needed to believe that most people were fundamentally honest. I still needed to hire people and give them genuine responsibility. I just did it differently. The difference was this. I started paying attention, not in a paranoid way where everything seemed suspicious, in an actual way where I understood that trust wasn't something you gave and then forgot about. It was something you maintained by showing up, by knowing what was happening, by staying connected to the work that other people were doing on your behalf. I realized that what I'd actually been doing with Marcus was refusing to do my job. I'd hired him to manage operations, but then I'd stopped operating. I'd stopped paying attention. I'd outsourced not just the work, but the awareness of what the work actually was. That was my mistake, not the trust itself, but the abandonment that came with it. I'd trusted him, but I hadn't verified anything. I'd given him access, but I hadn't maintained any real understanding of how that access was being used. I'd created a situation where theft became less a matter of him being criminal and more a matter of the system I'd set up being completely vulnerable to it. A year after Marcus was released from prison, I got a letter from someone I didn't know. It was from a woman named Patricia who'd worked in the accounting department under Marcus. She'd noticed the fraudulent accounts before it became my catastrophe, but she hadn't said anything because she was afraid. She was afraid of what it would mean to accuse her supervisor of something so serious. She was afraid of being wrong. She was afraid of what it might do to her job if she raised concerns that turned out to be unfounded. So she'd kept quiet and watched it happen anyway. Reading her letter, I realized something I should have understood all along. The people who see problems aren't always the ones who speak up about them. Sometimes they're afraid. Sometimes they don't have the authority to do anything about what they're seeing. Sometimes they've learned that pointing out problems gets them labeled as troublemakers. Patricia had known something was wrong. If I'd created a culture where she felt safe coming forward, none of this would have happened. The company stabilized. We grew again. I hired cautiously and paid attention constantly. I built systems that made fraud harder to accomplish without being noticed. But mostly I just became the kind of leader who showed up, who understood the finances, who stayed connected to what was happening in his own business, instead of outsourcing both the work and the awareness of it. That's the thing about trust that nobody tells you. It's not the opposite of paranoia. It's the opposite of abandonment. Real trust means paying attention. It means staying involved. It means being the person who knows what's actually going on, instead of the person who finds out when an accountant calls with questions about unexpected payments. Marcus is working in construction now, I heard through mutual contacts. He's not in a management position. He's doing labor. He's probably fine. He probably tells the story differently than it actually happened. He probably believes his own version of events by now. That's usually how these things work. What matters to me is not what Marcus does now or how he tells the story to other people. What matters is what I learned about the kind of leader I want to be. The kind of person who takes responsibility seriously enough to actually understand what's happening in his own company. The kind of person who creates space for other people to speak up if they see problems. The kind of person who trusts, but trusts in a way that includes actual attention and real awareness. If this story made you think about trust and verification and the difference between blindly believing in someone and actually showing up to understand what they're doing, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love to have you here for what comes next.